Okay, this chapter is called Nest Building. After another week of rain, the high arch of blue sky appeared again, and the sun which poured down was quite hot. Though there had been no chance to see either the secret garden or Dickon, Mistress Mary had enjoyed herself very much. The week had not seemed long. She had spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking about Rajas or gardens or Dickon and the cottage on the moor. They had looked at the splendid books and pictures, and sometimes Mary had read things to Colin, and sometimes he had read a little to her. When he was amused and interested, she thought he scarcely looked like an invalid at all, except that his face was so colorless and he was always on the sofa. "You are a sly young one to listen and get out of your bed to go following things up like you did that night," Mrs. Medlock said once. "But there's no saying it's not been a sort of blessing to the lot of us. He's not had a tantrum or a whining fit since you made friends. The nurse was just going to give up the case because she was so sick of him, but she says she doesn't mind staying now you've gone on duty with her." In her talks with Colin, Mary had tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. There were certain things she wanted to find out from him, but she felt that she must find them out without asking him direct questions. In the first place, as she began to like to be with him, she wanted to discover whether he was the kind of boy you could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dickon, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden no one knew anything about that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. But she had not known him long enough to be sure. The second thing she wanted to find out was this: if he could be trusted, if he really could, wouldn't it be possible to take him out to the garden without having anyone find it out? The grand doctor had said he must have fresh air, and Colin had said he would not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Perhaps if he had a great deal of fresh air and knew Dickon and the robin and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. Mary had seen herself in the glass sometimes lately, when she realized that she looked quite a different creature than the child she was when she arrived from India. This child looked nicer. Even Martha had seen a change in her. "The air from the moor's done thee good already," she said. "Thou'rt not nigh so yeller, and thou'rt not nigh so scrawny. Even thy hair doesn't slamp down on the head so flat. It's got some life in it, so it sticks out a bit." "It's like me," said Mary. "It's growing stronger and fatter. I'm sure there's more of it." "It looks it for sure," said Martha, ruffling it up around her face. "Thou'rt not half so ugly when it's that way, and there's a bit of red in thy cheeks." If gardens and fresh air had been good for her, perhaps they would be good for Colin. But then, if he hated people to look at him, perhaps he would not like to see Dickon. "Why does it make you angry when you are looked at?" she inquired one day. "I always hated it," he answered, "even when I was very little. Then when they took me to the seaside and I used to lie in my carriage, everybody used to stare and ladies would stop and talk to my nurse. Then they would begin to whisper, and I knew then they were saying I shouldn't live to grow up. Then sometimes the ladies would pat my cheek and say, 'Poor child.' Once when a lady did that, I screamed out loud and bit her hand. She was so frightened she ran away." "She thought you had gone mad like a dog," said Mary, not at all admiringly. "I don't care what she thought," said Colin, frowning. "I wonder why you didn't scream and bite me when I came into your room," said Mary. Then she began to smile slowly. "I thought you were a ghost or a dream. You can't bite a ghost or a dream, and if you scream, they don't care." "Would you hate it if a boy looked at you?" Mary asked uncertainly. He lay on back on his cushion and paused thoughtfully. "There's one boy," he said quite slowly, as if he were thinking over every word. "There's one boy I believe I shouldn't mind. It's that boy who knows where the foxes live, Dickon." "I'm sure you wouldn't mind him," said Mary. "The birds don't, and other animals," he said, still thinking it over. "Perhaps that's why I shouldn't. He's a sort of animal charmer, and I am a boy animal." Then he laughed, and she laughed too. In fact, it ended in both their laughing a great deal and finding the idea of a boy animal hiding in his hole very funny indeed. What Mary felt afterward was that she need not fear about Dickon. Thinking maybe I could put another log on there. Maybe this one. It's kind of hefty.
Whoa.
Watch your tone there, fire. That bark on there is gonna go up real good. Got a nice roaring pile.
Gotta admit, crackling is very one of the things that draws you to a fire.
It's light and sound. It's action. It's nature at work and nature being destroyed. Pretty good. Yeah, that is much better. On that first morning when the sky was blue again, Mary wakened very early. The sun was pouring in slanting rays through the blinds, and there was something so joyous in the sight of it that she jumped out of bed and ran to the window. She drew up the blinds and opened the window itself, and a great waft of fresh scented air blew in upon her. The moor was blue, and the whole world looked as if something magic had happened to it. There were tender little fluting sounds here and there, as if scores of birds were beginning to tune up for a concert. Mary put her hand out of the window and held it in the sun. "It's warm, warm," she said. "It will make the green points push up and up and up. It will make the bulbs and roots work and struggle with all their might under the earth." She kneeled down and leaned out of the window as far as she could, breathing big breaths and sniffing the air until she laughed, because she remembered what Dickon's mother had said about the end of his nose quivering like a rabbit's. "It must be very early," she said. "The little clouds are all pink, and I've never seen the sky look like this. No one is up. I don't even hear the stable boys." A sudden thought made her scramble to her feet. "I can't wait. I'm going to see the garden." She had learned to dress herself by this time, and she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small side door which she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall. She unchained and unbolted and unlocked, and when the door was open, she sprang across the step with one bound, and there she was, standing on the grass, which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her and warm, sweet wafts about her, and the fluttering and twittering and singing coming from every bush and tree. She clasped her hands for pure joy and looked up into the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and flooded with springtime light that she felt she must flute and sing aloud herself, and knew that thrushes and robins and skylarks could not possibly help it. She ran around the shrubs and paths toward the secret garden. "It is all different already," she said. "The grass is greener and things are sticking up everywhere. Things are uncurling and green buds of leaves are showing. This afternoon I am sure Dickon will come." The long, warm rain had done strange things to the herbaceous beds which bordered the walk by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing out from the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal purple and yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before, Mistress Mary would not have seen how the world was waking up, but now she missed nothing. When she had reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy, she was startled by a loud, curious sound. It was the caw of a crow, and it came from the top of the wall. And when she looked up, there sat a big, glossy plumaged, blue-black bird, looking down at her very wisely indeed. She had never seen a crow so close before, and he made her a little nervous, But the next moment he spread his wings and flapped away across the garden. She hoped he was not going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open, wondering if he would. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he probably did intend to stay, because he had alighted on a dwarf apple tree, and under the apple tree was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail, and both of them were watching the stooping body and rust-red head of Dickon, who was kneeling on the grass working hard. Mary flew across the garden to him. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon," she cried out. "How could you get here so early? How could you? The sun has only just got up." He got up himself, laughing and glowing, tousled. His eyes looked like a bit of the sky. He said, "I was up long before him. How could I have stayed abed? The world's all fair. Begun again this morning, it has. And it's working and humming and scratching and piping, nest building and breathing out scents, till you've got to be out on it instead of lying on your back. When the sun did jump up, the moor went mad for joy, and I was in the midst of the heather, and I run like mad myself, shouting and singing, and I come straight here. I couldn't have stayed away. Why, the garden was lying here waiting." Mary put her hands on her chest, panting, as if she had been running herself. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon, I'm so happy I can scarcely breathe." Seeing him talking to a stranger, the little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree and came to him, and the rook, cawing once, flew down from its branch and settled quietly on his shoulder. "This is the little fox cub," he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. "It's named Captain, and this here's Soot. Soot, he flew across the moor with me, and Captain, he run the same as if the hounds had been after him. They both felt same as I did." Neither of the creatures looked as if he were the least afraid of Mary. When Dickon began to walk about, Soot stayed on his shoulder, and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. "See here," said Dickon. "See how these is pushed up, and these, and look at these here." He threw himself upon his knees, and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon a whole clump of crocuses burst into purple and orange and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. "You never kiss a person that way," she said when she lifted her head. "Flowers are so different." He looked puzzled, but smiled. He said, "I've kissed Mother many a time that way when I come in from the moor after a day's roaming. She stood there at the door in the sun, looking so glad and so comfortable." They ran from one part of the garden to another, and found so many wonders that they were obliged to remind themselves that they must speak whispering or speak low. He showed her swelling leaf buds on rose branches which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green points pushing through the mold. They put their eager young noses close to the earth and sniffed its warm springtime breathing. They dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture until Mistress Mary's hair was as tumbled as Dickon's, and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner. A little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dickon stood quite still and put his hand on Mary almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in church. "We munnot stir," he whispered in broad Yorkshire. "We munnot scarce breathe. I know he was mate hunting when I seed him last. It's Ben Weatherstaff's robin. He's building his nest. He'll stay here if us don't fight him." They settled down slowly upon the grass and sat there without moving. "Us mustn't seem as if us was watching him too close," said Dickon. "He'd be out with us for good if he got the notion us was interfering now. He'll be a good bit different till all this is over. He's setting up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things ill. He's got no time for visiting and gossiping. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if us was grass and trees and bushes." Excuse me. "Then when he's got used to seeing us, I'll chirp a bit and he'll know us'll not be in his way." Mistress Mary was not at all sure that she knew, as Dickon seemed to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes. But he had said the queer thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be easy to him. And indeed she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to turn quietly green and put out branches and leaves. But he only sat wonderfully still, and when he spoke, dropped his voice to such softness that it was curious that she could hear him, but she could. It's part of the springtime, this nest building is. I warned it's been going on in the same every year since the world was begun. They've got their way of thinking and doing things, and a body had better not meddle. You can lose a friend in the springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious. If we talk to him about it, I can't help looking at him, Mary said as softly as possible. We must talk of something else. There's something I want to tell you. He'll like it better if us talks or something else, said Dickon. What is it thou's got to tell me? Well, do you know about Colin? She whispered. He turned his head to look at her. What does thou know about him? He asked. I've seen him. I've been to talk to him every day this week. He wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying. Dickon looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. I am glad of that, he exclaimed. I'm right down glad. It makes me easier. I knowed I must say nothing about him, and I don't like having to hide things. Don't you like hiding the garden? Said Mary. I'll never tell about it, he answered. But I says to Mother, Mother, I got a secret to keep. It's not a bad un, thou knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest is. Thou doesn't mind, does thou? Mary always wanted to hear about his mother. What did she say? She asked, not at all afraid to hear. Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly. It was just like her what she said. She give my head a bit of a rub and laughed and says, Eh, lad, thou can have all the secrets thou likes. I've knowed thee 12 year. How did you know about Colin? Asked Mary. Everybody knowed as Mester Craven knowed there was a little lad as was like to be a cripple, and they knowed Mester Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Mester Craven because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady, and they was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children, because she knows us has been brought up to be trusty. How did thou find out about him? Martha was in fine trouble the last time she came home. She said thou'd heard him frettin' and thou was asking questions, and she didn't know what to say. Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind, which had wakened her, and about the far-off sounds of the complaining voice which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and had ended with her opening of the door of the dimly lighted room with the carven four-postered bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head. Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say. They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, and it's because his eyes is so like his mother's and yet so different in his miserable bit of face. Do you think he wants to die? Whispered Mary. No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother said that's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them's as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven, he'd buy anything as money could buy for the poor lad, but he'd like to forget as he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him some day and find he's growed a hunchback. Colin's so afraid of it himself that he won't sit up, said Mary. He says he's always thinking that if he could feel a lump coming, he should go crazy and scream himself to death. He oughtn't to lie there thinking things like that, said Dickon. No lad could get well thought of them sort of things. The fox was lying on the grass close by, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked round the garden. When first we got here, he said, it seemed as if everything was gray. Look round now and tell me as if thou doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, the gray wall is changing. It's as if a green mist were creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil. Aye, said Dickon, and it'll be greener and greener till the gray's all gone. Can thou guess what I was thinking? I know it was something nice, said Mary. I believe it was something about Colin. I was thinking I was thinking that if he was out here, he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break the rose bushes, and he'd be likely healthier. I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humor to come out here and lie under the trees in his carriage. I've been wondering that myself. I've thought of it almost every time I've talked to him. I wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wondered if we could bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he would go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out. Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. Oh, time to put some more wood on the fire.
Here you go. There he is.
Oh, we've been joined by a cat. He's probably upset that I've put my iPad in his spot. Let's see if I can make him a little room. There you go, Boofus. You can have that spot.
Or you can stay here.
Or you can stay sitting on your dad. It's a good place. I'm going to refill my water. Reading is thirsty work.
You okay, buddy? Oh, you okay?
He's decided he doesn't want to be up here after all. He'd probably prefer to walk in front of the camera and get his tail in the way of the lens. That's something he excels at. So I'm trying not to wear myself out by reading nonstop forever and ever through this stream. I know I've had a long day and my voice could get tired pretty easily, so I'm taking breaks and sips. It's a marathon, not a foot race. And I am attempting to be the tortoise, not the hare. Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. It'd be good for him, I warrant. Us'd not be thinking he'd better never been born. Us'd be just two children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. Two lads and a little lass looking on at the springtime. I warrant it'd be better than doctor's stuff. He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back that it's made him queer, said Mary. He knows a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything else. He says he has been too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it is a secret. I daren't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it. Us'll have him out here sometime for sure, said Dickon. I could push his carriage well enough. Has thou noticed how the robin and his mate have been workin' while we've been sittin' here? Look at him perched on that branch, wonderin' where it'd be best to put that twig he's got in his beak. He made one of his low whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of friendly advice. Wheresoever thou puts it, it'll be all right. Thou knew how to build the nest before thou came out the egg. Get on with thee, lad. Thou'st got no time to lose. Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him, Mary said, laughing delightedly. Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he understood every word. And I know he likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited he would rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed. Dickon laughed too and went on talking. Thou knows us won't trouble thee, he said to the robin. Us is near being wild things ourselves. Us is nest building too, bless thee. Look out thou doesn't tell on us. And though the robin did not answer, because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to his own corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eye meant that he would not tell their secret for the world. Chapter 16. I won't, said Mary. That's the name of the chapter. That's actually a pretty good chapter name. Makes you wonder, what is she saying I won't? Well, those logs are hissing. Let me try and put something drier on there. Maybe cross that way. Someday that wood's gonna burn right perfect. For right now, not so much. They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. Tell Colin I can't come and see him yet, she said to Martha. I'm very busy in the garden. Martha looked rather frightened. Miss Mary, it may put him all out of humor when I tell him that. But Mary was not as afraid of him as other people were, and she was not a self-sacrificing person. I can't stay, she answered. Dickon's waiting for me, and she ran away. The afternoon was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already nearly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden, and most of the roses and trees had been pruned or dug about. Dickon had brought a spade of his own, and he had taught Mary to use all of her tools, so that by the time it was plain that though the lovely wild place was not likely to become a gardener's garden, it would be a wilderness of growing things before the springtime was over. There'll be apple blossoms and cherry blossoms overhead, Dickon said, working away with all his might. And there'll be peach and plum trees in bloom against the walls, and the grass will be a carpet of flowers. The little fox and the rook were as happy and busy as they were, and the robin and his mate flew backward and forward like tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped his black wings and soared away over the treetops in the park. Each time he came back and perched near Dickon and cawed several times as if he were relating his adventures, and Dickon talked to him just as he had talked to the robin. Once, when Dickon was so busy that he did not answer him at first, Soot flew onto his shoulder and gently tweaked his ear with his large beak. When Mary wanted to rest a little, Dickon sat down with her under a tree, and once he took his pipe out of his pocket and played soft, strange little notes, and 2 squirrels appeared on the wall and looked and listened. "Thou's a good bit stronger than thou was," Dickon said, looking at her as she was digging. "Thou's beginning to look different for sure." Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits. "I'm getting fatter and fatter every day," she said. "Mrs. Medlock will have to get me some bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It isn't so flat and stringy." The sun was beginning to set and sending deep-colored rays slanting under the trees when they parted. "It'll be fine tomorrow. I'll be at work by sunrise." "So will I," said Mary. She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet would carry her. She wanted to tell Colin about Dickon's fox cub and the rook, about what the springtime had been doing. She felt sure he would like to hear. So it was not very pleasant when she opened the door of her room to see Martha standing waiting for her with a doleful face. "What is the matter? What did Colin say when you told him I couldn't come?" "Eh," said Martha, "I wish thou'd gone. He was nigh going into one of his tantrums. There's been a nice to-do all afternoon to keep him quiet. He would watch the clock all the time." Mary's lips pinched together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin was, and she saw no reason why an ill-tempered boy should interfere with the things she liked best. She knew nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous, and who did not know that they could control their tempers and need not make other people ill and nervous too. When she had had a headache in India, she had done her best to see that everybody else also had a headache, or something quite as bad. And she felt she was quite right, but of course now she felt that Colin was quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went into his room. He was lying flat on his back in bed, and he did not turn his head toward her as she came in. This was a bad beginning, and Mary marched up to him with her stiff manner. "Why didn't you get up?" she said. "I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered without looking at her. "I made them put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached and my head ached and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was working in the garden with Dickon," said Mary. Colin frowned and condescended to look at her. "I won't let that boy come here if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me." Mary flew into a fine passion. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate and did not care what happened. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again," she retorted. "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you," said Colin. "They shall drag you in." "Shall they, Mr. Rajah? They may drag me in, but they can't make me talk when they get me in here. I'll sit and clench my teeth, and I'll never tell you one thing. I won't even look at you. I'll stare at the floor." They were a nice, agreeable pair as they glared at each other. If they had been 2 little street boys, they would have sprung at each other and had a rough-and-tumble fight. As it was, they did the next thing to it. "You are a selfish thing," said Colin. "What are you?" said Mary. "Selfish people always say that. Anyone is selfish who doesn't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I ever saw." "I'm not," snapped Colin. "I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon is. He keeps you playing in the dirt when he knows I'm all by myself. He's selfish, if you like." Mary's eyes flashed fire. "He's nicer than any other boy that ever lived. He's like an angel." It might sound rather silly to say that, but she did not care. "A nice angel," Colin sneered ferociously. "He's a common cottage boy off the moor." "He's better than a common Rajah. He's 1,000 times better." Because she was the stronger of the two, she was beginning to get the better of him. The truth was, he had never had a fight with anyone like himself in his life, and upon the whole, it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew anything about that. He turned his head on the pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear was squeezed out and ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for anyone else. I'm not as selfish as you, because I'm always ill and I'm sure there's a lump coming in on my back, and I am going to die besides. You're not, contradicted Mary unsympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard such a thing said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased, if a person could be both at the same time. I'm not? I am. You know I am. Everybody says so. I don't believe it, said Mary sourly. You just say that to make people sorry. I believe you're proud of it. Well, I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy, it might be true, but you're too nasty. In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage. Get out of the room, he shouted, and caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. He was not strong enough to throw it far, and it fell only at her feet. But Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker. I'm going, she said, and I won't come back. She walked to the door, and when she reached it, she turned round and spoke again. I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things. Dickon brought his fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them, but now I won't tell you a single thing. She marched out of the door and closed it behind her, and there, to her great astonishment, she found the trained nurse standing as if she had been listening, and, more amazing still, she was laughing. She was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse at all, as she could not bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone else who would take her place. Mary had never liked her, and as she simply stood and gazed up at her, she stood giggling into her handkerchief. What are you laughing at? She asked her. At you two young ones, said the nurse. It's the best thing that could happen to the sickly, pampered thing is to have someone to stand up to him that's as spoiled as himself. And she laughed into her handkerchief again. If he'd had a young vixen of a sister to fight with, it would have been the saving of him. Is he going to die? I don't know and I don't care, said the nurse. Hysterics and temper are half what ails him. What are hysterics? Asked Mary. You'll find out if you work him into a tantrum after this. But at any rate, you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad of it. Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she had come in from the garden. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. She had looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she had meant to try to make up her mind whether it would be safe to trust him with the great secret. She had been beginning to think it would be, but now she had changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get any fresh air and die if he liked. It would serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelenting that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil creeping over the world and the soft wind blowing down the moor. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been temporarily replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover had been removed and revealed that it was full of neat packages. Mr. Craven sent it to you, said Martha. It looks as if it had picture books in it. Mary remembered what he had asked her the day she had gone to his room. Do you want anything? Dolls? Toys? Books? She opened the package, wondering if he had sent a doll, and also wondering what she should do with it if he had. But he had not sent one. There were several beautiful books, such as Colin had, and 2 of them were about gardens and full of pictures. There were 2 or 3 games, and there was a beautiful little writing case with a gold monogram on it and a gold pen and inkstand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd her anger out of her mind. She had not expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart grew quite warm. I can write better than I can print, she said, and the first thing I will write with it will be a letter to tell him I am much obliged. If she had been friends with Colin, she would have run to show him her presents at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the gardening books, perhaps tried playing the games, and he would have enjoyed himself so much he would never once have thought he was going to die or have to put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump coming. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable, frightened feeling, because he always looked so frightened himself. He said that if he felt even quite a little lump some day, He should know his hunch had begun to grow. Something he had heard about Mrs. Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him that idea, and he had thought over it in secret until it was firmly fixed in his mind. Mrs. Medlock had said his father's back had begun to show its crookedness in that way when he was a child. He had never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, as they called them, grew out of his hysterical hidden fear. Mary had been sorry for him when he had told her. He always began to think about it when he was cross or tired, she said to herself, and he has been cross today. Perhaps he's been thinking about it all afternoon. She stood still, looking down at the carpet and thinking. I said I would never go back again, she hesitated, knitting her brows. But perhaps, just perhaps, I will go and see if he wants me in the morning. Perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again, but I think I'll go. All right, I'm going to grab a real quick break. Story's getting real dramatic.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Fire's looking good.
Yeah.
Chapter 17. A Tantrum. She had got up very early in the morning and had worked hard in the garden, and she was tired and sleepy. So as soon as Martha had brought her supper and she had eaten it, she was glad to go to bed. As she laid her head on the pillow, she murmured to herself, "I'll go out before breakfast and work with Dickon, and then afterward, I believe, I'll go to see him." She thought it was the middle of the night when she was awakened by such dreadful sounds that she jumped out of bed in an instant. What was it? What was it? The next minute she felt quite sure she knew. Doors were opened and shut, and there was hurrying feet in the corridors, and someone was crying and screaming at the same time, screaming and crying in a horrible way. "It's Colin," she said. "He's having one of those tantrums the nurse called hysterics. How awful it sounds." As she listened to the sobbing screams, she did not wonder that people were so frightened that they gave him his own way in everything rather than hear them. She put her hands over her ears and felt sick and shivering. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do," she kept saying. "I can't bear it." Once she wondered if he would stop if she dared to go to him, and then she remembered how he had driven her out of the room and thought that perhaps the sight of her might make him worse. Even when she pressed her hands more tightly over her ears, she could not keep the awful sounds out. She hated them so and was so terrified by them that suddenly they began to make her angry, and she felt as if she would like to fly into a tantrum herself and frighten him as he was frightening her. She was not used to anyone's tempers but her own. I think that could use a little more wood. This big log right here in the front doesn't want to burn that much, so I'm going to give it a big helping hand of air. There we go. Sometimes the hellfire needs a helping hand. A helping hand. That's exactly what we needed, a good fire.
Great way to bring a great day to a close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see that log in the front is starting to catch where we can see it now. Let's see. Mary was not used to anybody's tempers but her own. She took her hands from her ears and sprang up and stamped her feet. "He ought to be stopped. Somebody ought to make him stop. Somebody ought to beat him," she cried. Just then she heard feet almost running down the corridor, and her door opened and the nurse came in. She was not laughing now by any means. She even looked rather pale. "He's worked himself into hysterics," she said in a great hurry. "He'll do himself harm. No one can do anything with him. You come and try like a good child. He likes you." "He turned me out of the room this morning," said Mary, stamping her foot with excitement. The stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was she had been afraid she might find Mary crying and hiding her head under the bedclothes. "That's right," she said. "You're in the right humor. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as you ever can." It was not until afterward that Mary realized the thing had been funny as well as dreadful. that it was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened that they came to a little girl just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin himself. She flew along the corridor, and the nearer she got to the screams, the higher her temper mounted. She felt quite wicked by the time she reached the door. She slapped it open with her hand and ran across the room to the four-posted bed. "You stop!" she shouted. "You stop! I hate you! Everyone hates you! I wish everybody would run out of the house and let you scream yourself to death. You will scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would." A nice, sympathetic child could never have thought nor said such things, but it just happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for this hysterical boy, whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict. He had been lying on his face, beating his pillow with his hands, and he actually almost jumped around. He turned so quickly at the sound of the furious little voice. His face looked dreadful, white and red and swollen. He was gasping and choking, but savage little Mary did not care an atom. "If you scream another scream, I'll scream too, and I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you. I'll frighten you." He actually had stopped screaming because she had startled him so. The scream which had been coming almost choked him. The tears were streaming down his face, and he shook all over. "I can't stop. I can't." "You can," shouted Mary. "Half that ails you is hysterics and temper. Just hysterics, hysterics, hysterics." And she stamped her foot each time she said it. "I felt the lump. I felt it," choked out Colin. "I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall die." And he began to writhe again and turned on his face and sobbed and wailed. But he didn't scream. "You didn't feel a lump," contradicted Mary fiercely. "If you did, it was only hysterical lump. Hysterics makes lumps. There's nothing the matter with your horrid back, nothing but hysterics. Turn over and let me look at it." She liked the word hysterics, and felt somehow as if it had an effect on him. He was probably like herself and had never heard it before. "Nurse," she commanded, "come here and show me his back this minute." The nurse, Mrs. Medlock, and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door staring at her, their mouths half open. All three had gasped with fright more than once. The nurse came forward as if she were half afraid. Colin was heaving with great breathless sobs. "Perhaps he won't let me," she hesitated. Colin heard her, however, and he gasped out in between sobs, Show her, she'll see then." It was a poor, thin back to look at when it was bared. Every rib could be counted, and every joint of the spine, though Mistress Mary did not count them as she bent over and examined them with a solemn, savage little face. She looked so sour and so old-fashioned that the nurse turned her head aside to hide the twitching of her mouth. There was just a minute's silence, for even Colin tried to hold his breath, while Mary looked up and down his spine, up and down, as intently as if she had been the great doctor from London. "There's not a single lump there," she said at last. "There's not a lump as big as a pin except backbone lumps, and you can only feel them because you're thin. I've got backbone lumps myself, and they used to stick out as much as yours do, until I began to get fatter, and I'm not fat enough yet to hide them. There's not a lump as big as a pin. If you ever say there is again, I shall laugh." No one but Colin himself knew what effect those crossly spoken childish words had on him. If he had ever had anyone to talk to about his secret terrors, if he had ever dared let himself ask questions, if he had had childish companions and had not lain on his back in the huge closed house, breathing an atmosphere heavy with the fears of people who were most of them ignorant and tired of him, he would have found out that most of his fright and illness was created by himself, that he had lain and thought of himself and his aches and weariness for hours and days and months and years. And now that an angry, unsympathetic little girl insisted obstinately that he was not as ill as he thought, he actually felt as if she might be speaking the truth. "I don't know," ventured the nurse, "that he thought he had a lump on his spine. His back is weak because he won't try to sit up. I could have told him there was no lump there." Colin gulped and turned his face a little to look at her. Could you?" he said pathetically. Yes, sir. There, said Mary, and she gulped too. Colin turned on his face again, and but for his long drawn, broken breaths, which were the dying down of his storm of sobbing, he lay still for a minute, though great tears streamed down his face and wet the pillow. Actually, the tears meant that a curious great relief had come to him. Presently he turned and looked at the nurse again, and strangely enough he was not like a Rajah at all as he spoke to her. Do you think I could live to grow up? The nurse was neither clever nor soft-hearted, but she could repeat some of the London doctor's words. You probably will if you will do what you are told to do, and not give way to your temper, and stay out a great deal in the fresh air. Colin's tantrum had passed, and he was weak and worn out with crying, and this perhaps made him feel gentle. He put out his hand a little toward Mary, and I am glad to say that her own tantrum having passed, she was softened too, and met him halfway with her hand, so that it was a sort of making up. I'll go out with you, Mary, he said. I shan't hate fresh air if we can find. He remembered just in time to stop himself from saying, if we can find the secret garden. And he ended, I shall like to go out with you if Dickon will come and push my chair. I do so want to see Dickon and the fox and the crow. The nurse remade the tumbled bed and shook and straightened the pillows. Then she made Colin a cup of beef tea and gave a cup to Mary, who was really very glad to get it after her excitement. Mrs. Medlock and Martha gladly slipped away, and after everything was neat and calm and in order, the nurse looked as if she would very gladly slip away also. She was a healthy young woman who resented being robbed of her sleep, and she yawned quite openly as she looked at Mary, who had pushed her big footstool close to the four-posted bed and was holding Colin's hand. You must go back to sleep and get your sleep out, she said. He'll drop off after a while if he's not too upset. Then I'll lie down myself in the next room. Would you like me to sing you that song I learned from my ayah? Mary whispered to Colin. His hand pulled hers gently, and he turned his tired eyes on her appealingly. Oh, yes, it's such a soft song. I shall go to sleep in a minute. I will put him to sleep, Mary said to the yawning nurse. You can go if you like. Well, said the nurse with an attempt at reluctance, if he doesn't go to sleep in half an hour, you must call me. Very well, answered Mary. The nurse was out of the room in a minute, and as soon as she was gone, Colin pulled Mary's hand again. I almost told, but I stopped myself in time. I won't talk. I'll go to sleep. But you said you had a whole lot of nice things to tell me. Do you think you've found anything at all about the way into the secret garden? Mary looked at his poor tired little face and swollen eyes, and her heart relented. Yes, I think I have. And if you will go to sleep, I will tell you tomorrow. His hand quite trembled. Oh, Mary, if I could get into it, I think I should live to grow up. Do you suppose that instead of singing the ayah song, you could just tell me softly as you did that first day what you imagine it looks like inside? I am sure it will make me go to sleep. Yes, answered Mary. Shut your eyes. He closed his eyes and lay quite still, and she held his hand and began to speak very slowly and in a very low, soft voice. I think it has all been left alone so long that it has grown all into a lovely tangle. I think the roses have climbed and climbed and climbed until they hang from the branches and the walls, and they creep over the ground, almost like a strange gray mist. Some of them have died, but many are alive, and when the summer comes, there will be curtains and fountains of roses. I think the ground is full of daffodils and snowdrops and lilies and iris, working their way out of the dark. Now the spring has begun, perhaps. The soft drone of her voice was making him stiller and stiller, and she saw it and went on. Perhaps they are coming up through the grass. Perhaps there are clusters of purple crocuses and gold ones even now. Perhaps the leaves are beginning to break out and uncurl, and perhaps the gray is changing, and a green gauze veil is creeping and creeping over everything. And the birds are coming to look at it, because it is so safe and still. And perhaps Very softly and slowly indeed, the robin has found a mate and is building a nest. And Colin was asleep. I had a hard time not laughing through some of that tantrum and fight there. Those two kids, they both were being so rotten.
It was so well done from the writer.
You can tell she knew something about children being
Yeah.
ornery. Big old front log just needs a little more encouraging. There's quite a bundle of hellfire in there, which is awesome. One more in there toward the back. Give it a little bit of a roof. Oh, pardon my behind. I'm so afraid that if I touch the microphone to move it while I get up and sit back down, that it's going to make like a really annoying noise. But then I hit it with my ass as I get up. So, six of one, half a dozen of the other. All right, chapter 18. We're 60% of the way through the book, according to the Kindle software. And I think this was a free version of the book, so it always has like a bunch of stuff at the end. So we are closer than 60% to the end of the story. I'm not sure we're going to get through the whole thing tonight, but we will definitely make good progress. All right, chapter 18 is titled, Thou Munnot Waste No Time. Of course, Mary did not waken early the next morning. She slept late because she was tired, and when Martha brought her breakfast, she told her that the Colin was quite quiet, and he was ill and feverish, as he always was after he had worn himself out with a fit of crying. Mary ate her breakfast slowly as she listened. He says he wishes thou would please go and see him as soon as thou can, Martha said. It's queer what a fancy he took to thee. Thou did give it to him last night for sure, didn't thou? No one else would have dared do it. Poor lad. He's been spoiled till salt won't save him. Mother says as the two worst things as can happen to a child is never to have his own way or always to have it. She doesn't know which is the worst. Thou was in a fine temper thyself, too. But when he says to me when I went into his room, please ask Miss Mary if she'll please come and talk to me. Think of him saying please, will you go, miss? I'll run and see Dickon first, said Mary. No, I'll go and see Colin first and tell him. I know what I'll tell him, she said with sudden inspiration. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room, and for a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed. His face was pitifully white, and there were dark circles round his eyes. I'm glad you came. My head aches, and I ache all over because I'm so tired. Are you going somewhere? Mary went and leaned against his bed. I won't be long. I'm going to Dickon, but I'm coming back. Colin, it's something about the garden. His whole face brightened and a little color came into it. Oh, is it? I dreamed about it all night. I heard you say something about gray changing into green, and I dreamed I was standing in a place all filled with trembling little green leaves, and there were birds on nests everywhere, and they looked so soft and still. I'll lie and think about it until you come back. In 5 minutes, Mary was with Dickon in their garden. The fox and the crow were with him, and this morning he had brought 2 tame squirrels. I came over on a pony this morning. Hey, he's a good little chap, Jump is. I brought these 2 in my pockets. This one here is called Nut, and this one here is called Shell. When he said Nut, one squirrel leaped onto his right shoulder, and when he said Shell, the other one leaped onto his left shoulder. When they sat down on the grass with Captain curled at their feet, Soot solemnly listening on a tree, and Nut and Shell nosing about close to them, it seemed to Mary that it would be scarcely bearable to leave such delightfulness. But when she began to tell her story, somehow the look in Dickon's funny face gradually changed her mind. She could see he felt sorrier for Colin than she did. He looked up at the sky and all about him. Just listen to them birds. The world seems full of 'em, all whistling and piping. Look at 'em darting about and harking at 'em calling to each other. Come springtime seems as if all the world's calling. The leaves is uncurling so you can see 'em, and my word, the nice smells there is about, sniffing with his happy, turned-up nose. And that poor lad lying shut up and seeing so little that he gets to thinking of things that sets him screaming. Oh my, we mun get him out here. We mun get him watching and listening, sniffing up the air, and just get him soaked through with sunshine. And we mun not lose no time about it. When he was very much interested, he often spoke quite broad Yorkshire, though at other times he tried to modify his dialect so that Mary could better understand. But she loved his broad Yorkshire and had in fact been trying to learn to speak it herself, so she spoke a little now. Aye, that we mun, she said, which meant, yes, indeed, we must. I'll tell thee what us'll do first, she proceeded, and Dickon grinned, because when the little wench tried to twist her tongue into speaking Yorkshire, it amused him very much. He's took a greatly fancy to thee. He wants to see thee, and he wants to see Soot and Captain. When I go back to his house to talk to him, I'll ax him if thou canna come and see him tomorrow, and bring thy creatures with thee. And then, in a bit, when there's more leaves out and happen a bud or 2, we'll get him to come out, and thou shalt push him in his chair, and we'll bring him here and show him everything. When she stopped, she was quite proud of herself. She had never made a long speech in Yorkshire before, and she had remembered very well. Thou mun talk a bit of Yorkshire like that to Mester Colin, Dickon chuckled. Thou'll make him laugh, and there's nowt as good for ill folk as laughing is. Mother says she believes as half an hour's good laughing every morning 'ud cure a chap as was making ready for typhus fever. I'm going to talk Yorkshire to him this very day, said Mary, chuckling herself. The garden had reached the time when every day and every night it seemed as if magicians were passing through it, drawing loveliness out of the earth and the boughs with wands. It was hard to go away and leave it all, particularly as Nut had actually crept onto her dress, and Shell had scrambled down the trunk of the apple tree they sat under and stayed there looking at her with inquiring eyes. But she went back to the house, and when she sat down close to Colin's bed, he began to sniff as Dickon did, though in not such an experienced way. You smell like flowers and fresh things. What is it you smell of? It's cool and warm and sweet all at the same time. It's the wind from the moor, said Mary. It comes a-sittin' on the grass under a tree with Dickon and with Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell. It's the springtime out of the doors and sunshine as smells so greatly. She said it as broadly as she could, and you do not know how broadly Yorkshire sounds until you've heard someone speak it. Colin began to laugh. What are you doing? I never heard you talk like that before. How funny it sounds. I'm giving thee a bit of Yorkshire, answered Mary triumphantly. I canna talk as gradely as Dickon and Martha, but I can see I can shape a bit. Doesn't thou understand a bit of Yorkshire when thou hears it? And thou a Yorkshire lad thyself, bred and born? I wonder thou art not ashamed of thy face. And then she began to laugh too, and they both laughed until they could not stop themselves. They laughed until the room echoed, and Mrs. Medlock, opening the door to come in, drew back into the corridor and stood listening amazed. "Well, upon my word," she said, speaking rather broad Yorkshire herself because there was no one to hear her, and she was so astonished. "Who ever heard the like? Whoever on earth would have thought it?" There was so much to talk about. It seemed as if Colin could never hear enough of Dickon and Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell and the pony whose name was Jump. Mary had run round into the wood with Dickon to see Jump. He was a tiny little shaggy moor pony, with thick locks hanging over his eyes and a pretty face and a nuzzling velvet nose. He was rather thin from living on moor grass, but he was as tough and wiry as if the muscle in his little legs had been made of steel springs. He had lifted his head and whinnied softly the moment he saw Dickon, and he had trotted up to him and put his head across his shoulder, and then Dickon had talked into his ear and Jump had talked back in odd little whinnies and puffs and snorts. Dickon had made him give Mary his small front hoof and kiss her on her cheek with his velvet muzzle. "Does he really understand everything Dickon says?" Colin asked. "It seems as if he does," answered Mary. "Dickon says anything will understand if you're friends with it for sure, but you have to be friends for sure." Colin lay quiet a little while, and his strange gray eyes seemed to be staring at the wall, but Mary saw he was thinking. "I wish I was friends with things," he said at last, "but I'm not. I never had anything to be friends with, and I can't bear people." "Can't you bear me?" asked Mary. "Yes, I can," he answered. "It's funny, but I even like you." "Ben Weatherstaff said I was like him," said Mary. "He said he'd warrant we both got the same nasty tempers. I think you are like him, too. We are all three alike, you and I and Ben Weatherstaff. He said we were neither of us much to look at, and we were as sour as we looked. But I don't feel as sour as I used to before I knew the Robin and Dickon." "Did you feel as if you hated people?" "Yes," answered Mary without any affectation. "I should have detested you if I had seen you before I saw the Robin and Dickon." Colin put out his thin hand and touched her. "Mary, I wish I hadn't said what I did about sending Dickon away. I hated you when you said he was like an angel, and I laughed at you, but perhaps he is." "Well, it's rather funny to say it," she admitted frankly, "because his nose does turn up a bit, and he has a big mouth, and his clothes have patches all over them, and he talks broad Yorkshire. But if an angel did come to Yorkshire and live on the moor, if there was a Yorkshire angel, I believe he'd understand the green things and know how to make them grow, and he would know how to talk to wild creatures as Dickon does, and they'd know he was friends for sure." Choking on my own water. Think I'm getting a little sniffle from the fire. I'm gonna go blow my nose. We'll pop a little more wood in there. I think something dry.
That piece right there.
Ooh, that's a nice big one. Yeah. That's gonna get things going real good. This is a good piece of fuel here too. I'm gonna put that where it'll do some good. And then right in there. A little more air. Oh, yeah, that extra log's going much better.
That's the one we split.
Oh, yeah, the big one. We split it into like 3 pieces. Well, we did promise it we would burn it for the trouble it caused us, so it's nice to see we don't go back on our word. I shouldn't mind Dickon looking at me, said Colin. I want to see him. I'm glad you said that, answered Mary, because quite suddenly it came into her mind that this was the minute to tell him. Colin knew something new was coming. Because what? He cried eagerly. Mary was so anxious that she got up from her stool and came to him and caught hold of both of his hands. Can I trust you? I trusted Dickon because birds trusted him. Can I trust you for sure, for sure? She implored. His face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. Yes, yes. Well, Dickon will come to see you tomorrow morning, and he'll bring his creatures with him. Oh, oh, cried Colin out in delight. To talk to the wild. But that's not all. Mary went on, almost pale with solemn excitement. The rest is better. There's a door into the garden. I found it. It's under the ivy on the wall. If he had been a strong, healthy boy, Colin probably would have shouted, Hooray, hooray! But he was weak and rather hysterical. His eyes grew bigger and bigger, and he gasped for breath. Oh, Mary, he cried out with a half sob. Shall I see it? Shall I get into it? Shall I live to get into it? And he clutched her hands and dragged her toward him. Of course you'll see it, snapped Mary indignantly. Of course you'll live to get into it. Don't be silly. And she was so unhysterical and natural and childish that she brought him to his senses, and he began to laugh at himself a few minutes afterward. She was sitting on the stool again, started telling him what she imagined the secret garden to be like, but what it really was. And Colin's aches and tiredness were forgotten. He was listening enraptured. It is just what you thought it would be, he said at last. It sounds just as if you had really seen it. You know, I said that when you told me first. Mary hesitated about 2 minutes and then boldly spoke the truth. I had seen it, and I had been in, she said. I found the key and I got in weeks ago, but I daren't tell you because I was so afraid I couldn't trust you for sure. Chapter 19. It has come. Of course, Dr. Craven had been sent for the morning after Colin had his tantrum. He was always sent for at once when such a thing occurred, and he always found, when he arrived, a white, shaken boy lying on his bed, sulky and still so hysterical that he was ready to break into fresh sobbing at the least word. In fact, Dr. Craven dreaded and detested the difficulties of these visits. On this occasion, he was away from Misselthwaite Manor until afternoon. How is he? He asked Mrs. Medlock rather irritably when he arrived. He will break a blood vessel in one of those fits some day. That boy is half insane with hysteria and self-indulgence. Well, sir, answered Mrs. Medlock, you'll scarcely believe your eyes when you see him. That plain, sour-faced child that's almost as bad as himself has just bewitched him. How she's done it, there's no telling. The Lord knows she's nothing to look at, and you scarcely ever hear her speak. But she did what none of us dare do. She just flew at him like a little cat last night and stamped her feet and ordered him to stop screaming, and somehow she startled him so that he actually did stop. And this afternoon, well, just come up and see, sir. It's past crediting. The scene which Dr. Craven beheld when he entered his patient's room was indeed rather astonishing to him. As Mrs. Medlock opened the door, he heard laughing and chattering. Colin was on his sofa in his dressing gown, and he was sitting up quite straight, looking at a picture in one of the garden books and talking to the plain child who, at that moment, could scarcely be called plain at all because her face was glowing with enjoyment. Those long spires of blue ones, we'll have a lot of those, Colin was announcing. They're called delphiniums. Dickon says they're larkspurs made big and grand, cried Mistress Mary. There are clumps there already. Then they saw Dr. Craven and stopped. Mary became quite still, and Colin started looking fretful. "I am sorry to hear you were ill last night, my boy," Dr. Craven said a trifle nervously. He was a rather nervous man. "I'm better now, much better," Colin answered, rather like a Rajah. "I'm going out in my chair in a day or two, if it is fine. I want some fresh air." Dr. Craven sat down by him and felt his pulse and looked at him curiously. "It must be a very fine day," he said, "and you must be careful not to tire yourself." "Fresh air won't tire me," said the young Rajah. As there had been occasions when this same young gentleman had shrieked aloud with rage and insisted that fresh air would give him cold and kill him, it is not to be wondered that this doctor felt somewhat startled. "I thought you did not like fresh air," he said. "I don't when I'm by myself," replied the young Rajah. "But my cousin is going out with me." "And the nurse, of course?" suggested Dr. Craven. "No, I will not have the nurse," so magnificently that Mary could not help remembering how the young native prince had looked with his diamonds and emeralds and pearls stuck all over him, the great rubies on his small dark hand he had waved to command his servants to approach with salams and receive his orders. "My cousin knows how to take care of me. I am always better when she is with me. She made me better last night. A very strong boy I know will push my carriage." Dr. Craven felt rather alarmed. If this tiresome, hysterical boy should chance to get well, he would himself lose all chance of inheriting Misselthwaite. But he was not an unscrupulous man, though he was a weak one, and he did not intend to let him run into actual danger. "He must be a strong boy and a steady boy," he said, "and I must know something about him. Who is he? What is his name?" "It's Dickon," Mary spoke up suddenly. She felt somehow sure that everybody who knew the moor must know Dickon. And she was right, too. She saw that in a moment Dr. Craven's serious face relaxed into a relieved smile. "Oh, Dickon. If it is Dickon, you will be safe enough. He's as strong as a moor pony is Dickon." "And he's trusty," said Mary. "He's the trustiest lad in Yorkshire." She started talking Yorkshire to Colin and forgot herself. "Did Dickon teach you that?" asked Dr. Craven, laughing outright. "I'm learning it as if it were French," she said. "It's like a native dialect in India. Very clever people try to learn them. I like it, and so does Colin." "Well, well," he said, "if it amuses you, perhaps it won't do any harm. Did you take your bromide last night, Colin?" "No," Colin answered. "I wouldn't take it at first, and after Mary made me quiet, she talked me to sleep in a low voice about the spring creeping into a garden." "That sounds soothing," said Dr. Craven, more perplexed than ever, and glancing sideways at Mistress Mary sitting on her stool, looking silently down at the carpet. "You are evidently better, but you must remember—" "I don't want to remember," interrupted the Rajah, speaking again. "When I lie by myself and remember, I begin to have pains everywhere, and I think of things that make me begin to scream because I hate them so. If there was a doctor anywhere who could make you forget you were ill instead of remembering it, I would have him brought here." And he waved a thin hand which ought really to have been covered with royal signet rings made of rubies. "It is because my cousin makes me forget that she makes me better." Dr. Craven had never made such a short stay after a tantrum. Usually he was obliged to remain a very long time and do a great many things. This afternoon he did not give any medicine or leave any new orders, and he was spared any disagreeable scenes. When he went downstairs, he looked very thoughtful, and when he talked to Mrs. Medlock in the library, she felt that he was a much puzzled man. "Well, sir, could you have believed it?" "It is certainly a new state of affairs," said the doctor, "and there's no denying it is better than the old one." "I believe Susan Sowerby's right. I do that," said Mrs. Medlock. "I stopped in her cottage on my way to Thwaite yesterday and had a bit of talk with her. She says to me, 'Well, Sarah Ann, she mayn't be a good child and she mayn't be a pretty one, but she's a child and children needs children.' We went to school together, Susan Sowerby and me." "She's the best sick nurse I know," said Dr. Craven. "When I find her in a cottage, I know the chances are that I shall save my patient." Looks like I need to save our patient. In just a moment. Looking good. And maybe I could use something over on the right side a little bit too. Maybe I could work with something to be an insulator. Oh, here, check this thin one out. That might do the trick. dropped my chapstick. Gonna have to crawl under the table. That's a much healthier fire now. I think Boo Boo is back there hunting a moth. He's jingling around a lot. Mrs. Medlock smiled. She was fond of Susan Sowerby. She's got away with her, has Susan, she went on quite volubly. I've been thinking all morning of one thing she said yesterday. She says, once when I was giving the children a bit of a preach after they'd been fighting, I says to 'em all, when I was at school my geography told us the world was shaped like an orange, and I found out before I was 10 that the whole orange doesn't belong to nobody. No one owns more than his bit of a quarter, and there's times it seems like there's not enough quarters to go around. But don't you, none of you, think as you own the whole orange, or you'll find out you're mistaken, and you won't find it out without hard knocks. What children learns from children, she says, is that there's no sense in grabbing at the whole orange, peel and all. If you do, you'll likely not get even the pips, and them's too bitter to eat. She's a shrewd woman, said Dr. Craven, putting on his coat. Well, she's got a way of saying things, ended Mrs. Medlock, much pleased. Sometimes I've said to her, hey, Susan, if you was a different woman and didn't talk such broad Yorkshire, I've seen the times when I should have said you was clever. My goodness, that's kind of... She said that to her friend. She's kind of that frenemy. Ugh. Mrs. Medlock. That night, Colin slept without once awakening, and when he opened his eyes in the morning, he lay still and smiled without knowing it. Smiled because he felt so curiously comfortable. It was actually nice to be awake, and he turned over and stretched his limbs luxuriously. He felt as if tight strings which had held him had loosened themselves and let him go. He did not know that Dr. Craven would have said that his nerves had relaxed and rested themselves. Instead of lying and staring at the wall and wishing he had not awakened, his mind was full of the plans he and Mary had made yesterday, of pictures of the garden and of Dickon and his wild creatures. It was so nice to have things to think about. And he had not been awake more than 10 minutes when he heard feet running along the corridor, and Mary was at the door. The next minute she was in the room and had run across to his bed, bringing with her a waft of fresh air full of the scent of the morning. You've been out, there's that nice smell of leaves, he cried. She had been running and her hair was loose and blown. She was bright with the air and pink-cheeked, though he could not see it. It's so beautiful, she said, a little breathless with her speed. You never saw anything so beautiful. It has come. I thought it had come the other morning, but it was only coming. It is here now. It has come this spring. Dickon says so. Has it? Cried Colin, and though he really knew nothing about it, he felt his heart beat. He actually sat up in bed. Open the window, he added, laughing half with joyful excitement and half at his own fancy. Perhaps we may hear golden trumpets. And though he laughed, Mary was at the window in a moment, and in a moment more it was opened wide. Freshness and softness and scents and birds' songs were pouring through. That's fresh air, she said. Lie on your back and draw in long breaths of it. That's what Dickon does when he's lying on the moor. He says he feels it in his veins, and it makes him strong, and he feels as if he could live forever and ever. Breathe it and breathe it. She was only repeating what Dickon had told her, but she caught Colin's fancy. "Forever and ever? Does it make him feel like that?" he said, and he did as she told him, drawing in long, deep breaths over and over again, until he felt that something quite new and delightful was happening to him. Mary was at his bedside again. "Things are crowding up out of the earth," she ran on in a hurry. "And there are flowers uncurling and buds on everything. The green veil has covered nearly all the gray, and the birds are in such a hurry about their nests for fear they may be too late that some of them are even fighting for places in the secret garden. And the rose bushes look as wick can be, and there are primroses in the lanes and woods, and the seeds we planted are up. Dickon has brought the fox and the crow and the squirrels and a newborn lamb." And then she paused for breath. The newborn lamb Dickon had found 3 days before lying by its dead mother among the gorse bushes on the moor. It was not the first motherless lamb he had found, and he knew what to do with it. He had taken it to the cottage wrapped in his jacket, and he had let it lie near the fire and fed it with warm milk. It was a soft thing with darling silly baby face and legs rather long for its body. Dickon had carried it over the moor in his arms, and its feeding bottle was in his pocket with a squirrel, and when Mary had sat under a tree with its limp warmness huddled on her lap, she had felt as if she were too full of strange joy to speak. A lamb, a living lamb who lay on your lap like a baby. She was describing it with great joy, and Colin was listening and drawing in long breaths of air when the nurse entered. She started a little at the sight of the open window. She had sat stifling in the room many a warm day because her patient was sure that open windows gave people cold. "Are you sure you're not chilly, Master Colin?" she inquired. "No," was the answer. "I am breathing long breaths of fresh air. It makes you strong. I am going to get up to the sofa for breakfast. My cousin will have breakfast with me." The nurse went away, concealing a smile, to give the order for 2 breakfasts. She found the servants' hall a more amusing place now than the invalid's chamber, and was just now everybody wanted to hear the news from upstairs. There was a great deal of joking about the unpopular young recluse who, as the cook had said, had found his master and good for him. The servants' hall had been very tired of the tantrums, and the butler, who was a man with a family, had more than once expressed his opinion that the invalid would be all the better for a good hiding. When Colin was on the sofa and breakfast for 2 was put up on the table, he made an announcement to the nurse in his most Rajah-like manner. "A boy and a fox and a crow, 2 squirrels, and a newborn lamb are coming to see me this morning. I want them brought upstairs as soon as they come. You are not to begin playing with the animals in the servants' hall and keep them there. I want them here." The nurse gave a slight gasp and tried to conceal it with a cough. "Yes, sir," she answered. "I'll tell you what you can do," added Colin, waving his hand. "You can tell Martha to bring them here. The boy is Martha's brother. His name is Dickon, and he is an animal charmer." "I hope the animals won't bite, Master Colin," said the nurse. "I told you he was a charmer," said Colin austerely. "Charmers' animals never bite." "There are snake charmers in India," said Mary, "and they can put their snakes' heads in their mouths." "Goodness!" shuddered the nurse. They ate their breakfast with the morning air pouring in upon them. Colin's breakfast was a very good one. Oh, I've lost my camera.
I think it ran out of battery.